This
Cool.
conference will now be recorded.
So, hi everyone, and welcome to today's ITE webinar, where we'll be discussing the topic of transport and climate change. My name is Cassie Min. I'm a transport planner at Jacobs, and I'm excited to be moderating this session today. So I get this to move. Before we begin, I would like to make an acknowledgement of country. ITE would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today. We would also like to pay our respects to elders both past and present. At ITE, we are very grateful for the support of our sponsors for making this webinar possible, as well as our key events including the annual breakfast, President's Dinner, and Student Awards. So just a couple of tech housekeeping items before we begin today. Firstly, if you can please remain on mute for this session, that would be great. And we welcome questions throughout the session. Just put those questions in the chat and we'll have a Q&A session at the very end. So in terms of today's session, we will have three wonderful speakers. We've got Petra Stock, previous program manager for the Cities and Policies team at Climate Works Australia. Dr. Elliot Fishman, Director of the Institute of Sensible Transport, and Alice Woodruff, Managing Director of Active City. So first presenting today is Petra Stock. Petra is an expert in energy and climate solutions with 18 years working across climate organisations, state and local government, consulting and the renewable energy industry. She has led climate solution strategies at Climate Works and the Climate Council. She's also been part of the planning and environmental approvals processes for large infrastructure projects and the review of Victoria's Aboriginal Heritage Act. Today, Petra will be providing an overview of Australia's transport emissions and where we sit in comparison to other countries. She'll also be discussing the main sustainable transport solutions and benefits of options for addressing the transport impact of climate change. And now I'll hand it over to you, Petra. So just give you the presenter role.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me here today. Two reasons I'm really excited to speak today. One is I'm really passionate about transport as one of the areas where there are solutions to help tackle climate change and also make more sustainable cities, better places to live. And also always really love talking to groups of engineers because originally I qualified as an engineer and have worked in fields which generally involve kind of translating technical information into plain English. But I really believe that engineers play a key role when it comes to climate change, either enabling fossil fuel related projects, but hopefully increasingly more of a role in actually making solutions happen that can help Australia and the rest of the world transition to a zero emissions future. So today, talking about transport, it's really exciting because I think we spend so much time in Australia talking about electricity and getting nowhere. And there's all these other sectors which are polluting and in which solutions exist to reduce our emissions. And transport is one of those great opportunities. And so I'll just kind of start I think I'll be giving some of the bigger picture kind of stats of Australia, and then Alice and Elliot will really give us more details on how we can implement some of the solutions. So why transport? Well, Australia's transport sector is one of our largest, and actually before coronavirus was our fastest growing area of greenhouse gas emissions. It makes up around 19% of Australia's annual emissions. That's around 100 million tonnes of greenhouse gases every year going into the atmosphere. And most of those emissions are coming from road transport, particularly cars. So that's an area that we really need to focus on. Around 81% of transport emissions come from road-related transport. There's been international scorecards which have looked at how different countries rank on transport, sort of the energy efficiency of transport systems, and Australia ranks really among the bottom countries. So we, in the scorecard I'm thinking of, which is by a group called ITE, we ranked below Russia, Mexico and Indonesia in terms of the efficiency of our transport system. And we got that score based on a whole range of, sorry, I'm just getting a little bit of feedback. I'm not sure if others are. Whole range of different measures, including the ratio of spending on roads versus public transport, the percentage of people using public transport versus car, the existence or not of mandatory vehicle emission standards. So across all these different measures, which give a pretty good look at the efficiency of a transport system, Australia ranks really poorly in global terms. Our road vehicle fleet is one of the most energy and emissions intensive. We also have the highest per capita aviation emissions in the OECD, and we're one of the few that doesn't have what's called mandatory greenhouse gas emission standards for our passenger vehicles, cars and light vehicles. Most other countries now have these mandatory vehicle emission standards, which basically means that new cars purchased over time emit less and less greenhouse gases per kilometre travelled or per sort of fuel use. We also have one of the more highest emissions in other respects. So we're not doing really well when it comes to our transport systems. I guess in summary, why is Australia doing so poorly? Well, we rely really heavily on our cars to get around. Our cars are more polluting than our equivalent countries. We have very low use of public transport, and as a country, we invest far less in public transport compared to roads, and we certainly can do better. And I'm just going to see. So I think there's huge room for improvement, and we really need to get going, because what we're seeing, particularly in response to the recovery measures from the coronavirus, is other countries are really investing huge amounts, particularly into sustainable transport. We've seen the UK, lots of European countries and cities, as well as New Zealand, investing in things like cycling and walking infrastructure to make sure that as people return to work after the coronavirus, they're not getting back in their car when they would have usually gone via public transport. They've got other options that are healthy and safe, and so a lot of these countries are reallocating roads space to be used for these other more sustainable transport measures. In the UK, they've just pledged around £2 billion for walking and cycling as part of their coronavirus recovery. And there's no reason for us not to have mandatory vehicle greenhouse gas emission standards. We don't have car manufacturing in Australia anymore, although that's not to say we will always be that way, but around 80% of the global car market is now covered by vehicle greenhouse gas emissions. And actually the Australian government did almost all of the preparatory work that it needs to do to introduce those standards back in 2017, and then after that seemed to be shelved, never implemented. So that's a real shame. That's something that can easily be done, that can really have a big impact. And we don't have any national target or programs to drive uptake of electric vehicles. And as a result, our uptake of electric vehicles is very low compared to similar countries. Around 0.6% of cars sold last year were electric. So around 1 million cars are sold every year, and a very small proportion of that, of those are electric vehicles. Much greater proportion in New Zealand, and in Norway now around 75% of new cars are electric. And all around the world, we've now got countries that are pledging to basically phase out fossil fuel transport. And more than 30 major cities, including London, Moscow, LA, are pledging to only buy zero emissions or electric buses from 2025. So there's heaps happening around the globe, and Australia really needs to get on board if we're going to sort of keep up with our with countries that we would usually compare ourselves to. There are good things happening in Australia. So New South Wales government, for example, has actually pledged to transition its entire bus fleet to electric, but as far as I'm aware, they haven't set a date on that. So we don't know if that's going to be a trickle over time as compared to these global cities, which are aiming to do that pretty soon. So different places where I've worked have looked at the issue of transport and what solutions are available. Most recently, ClimateWorks released a report that looked at all aspects of the transport sector, what solutions were available, and we sort of nailed that down to 4 different areas of solutions that are required. Firstly, and maybe seems more boring but is very important, is we know that states and territories around Australia all have set emissions targets to get to net zero emissions by 2050 or before, but very few of the states and territories have translated those targets for the transport sector. So we're not seeing infrastructure plans. So most states also have sort of long-term infrastructure plans, but we're not seeing those plans incorporating those net zero emissions targets. And that's really important for transport, because we know when we are building something today, it will most likely be around in 2050 when we need to be at zero. So we need to be making decisions today that are consistent with those targets. So we really need to see zero emissions become kind of embedded into every aspect that drives transport decisions and spending. So things like infrastructure plans, transport strategies, land use planning strategies and decisions, and obviously where our governments are spending their money. So we need to make sure that investments are actually supporting the shift towards zero emissions transport. But we also need to be shifting towards the more efficient transport options that are readily available, that are well known and can be implemented today. So things like public and active transport, things like electrified rail, they're more efficient ways of moving people around. They help with other transport issues such as congestion, such as noise and air pollution. But most importantly, they are also far less, have far fewer emissions per person or per kilometre travelled than fossil-fueled road transport. We also need to be shifting and improving our vehicle fleet. So a shift to renewable powered electric vehicles in particular for most passenger transport. And we're not just talking about cars. We know trams and trains are electric transport that we've had around for a long time. And in states like Victoria, we now have our tram network, which is powered by solar power. In the ACT as well, their light rail is powered by 100% renewable energy. Also electric buses. You saw all those cities around the world that are now shifting their fleets entirely to electric. And funnily enough, Australia actually had one of the first renewable powered electric buses in Adelaide, which still runs around the city loop. But we haven't seen the big shift to electric buses here in Australia, mostly just small scale pilot schemes. And so renewable powered electric vehicles is really a huge opportunity and way to reduce emissions. And we also need policies like mandatory emissions standards, electric vehicle targets. And I've also added down the bottom another area. We know the transport sector is one of the areas where there's a lot of technology companies coming in with what sometimes referred to as disruptive technologies or new transport innovations. And we need to make sure that governments are developing guidelines for the implementation of those technologies to make sure that the overall social and economic outcomes are creating more benefits than costs. So we know, through the experience of things like Uber ride hailing, how dramatically that has changed transport in cities. And it's not always predictable, and particularly if not governed by some sort of guidelines or decision regulations. In a lot of cities around the world, innovations like that have actually increased the amount of traffic on roads, increased the amount of idling, and can have negative consequences for emissions. So we really need to have guidelines around all these new innovations that are coming in, drone delivery services, electric helicopters. There's a whole host of these technologies, and we need to make sure that all of these transport decisions are fitting in with the goal of reaching zero emissions. So just to summarize, I guess it's not rocket science. The key solutions to transport is to transition to renewable powered electric vehicles for the most part, and to get more people to use more efficient transport solutions, things like public and active transport, and also other more efficient means of transport like electrified freight rail. And I think now is a really great time to be thinking about what sort of a transport future we want for Australia, because we've had this experience through the coronavirus where people have changed their transport behaviours significantly. They have, not through choice, been exposed to other options that, instead of flying to Sydney for a meeting, having it over Zoom. there's been this dramatic shift. So it's a real opportunity to make sure that when we recover from the coronavirus, that we do that in a sustainable way. And of course, we're seeing governments around Australia starting to think about economic recovery packages. So a large part of that is likely to be investment in infrastructure. So it would be really great if that infrastructure also supported the shift towards zero emissions transport in the future. And there are a lot of reasons for wanting to do that. One is public transport investments generally create more jobs per dollar spend than roads. So there was a big review of US stimulus spending back in the global financial crisis, and that found that the jobs per dollar spent was much greater for investments in public transport. Also, it creates, so you create jobs both in the building of that infrastructure, but also providing more accessible public transport enables people to access employment. And it also provides affordability, so helping to address the issue that people, you know, we will be going through a tougher economic time. People will have less disposable income. And we spend so much time in Australia talking about electricity costs, but actually household spending on transport is around 5 times what households spend each week on electricity. So it's a real opportunity by providing sustainable transport options that are affordable that can really help people through this time. And of course, you know, there's just so many benefits, less congestion, healthier, quieter cities, less noise, and I think also helping to support some local manufacturing that has started in Australia. For example, I think one of the most beautiful transition examples in Australia is in the north of Adelaide, where they used to manufacture cars and was really an area that was heavily hit when the large car manufacturers left Australia. But that area is now manufacturing electric buses and other renewable and battery technologies. And one of the examples is Precision Buses, which is now building buses to run on South Australia's public transport system and also their airport bus network. So, you know, it's sort of a return of vehicle manufacturing, but in a completely different way. And that is another opportunity for Australia to really grow jobs, but also help tackle our transport emissions and create, you know, a brighter future for Australia. So just in conclusion, you know, there's loads more details, but you know, the solutions are available, they're mature, they're cost effective. We should just really, we really need to get on and catch up to where some of our international competitors are in Australia. And I've just provided some examples of some of the reports which give greater detail on emissions and transport solutions. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Petra, for the presentation. Next, we have Dr. Elliot Fishman. So Elliot is a leading thinker on integrated transport and sustainable mobility planning, having provided advice to the Prime Minister's Office, Transport for London, and the New York City Department of Transportation. In recent years, he has prepared ambitious best practice transport strategies for local governments in Victoria and New South Wales. Today, Elliot will be discussing Melbourne's transport pattern, Australian emission patterns, and pathways to lowering transport emissions, and ingredients for a successful approach. I'll now pass it on to Elliot.
Thanks, Cassandra. Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks very much for coming along. I'll just see if I can get this camera working as well. Okay, all right, thanks very much. It's great to have so many people here this afternoon. I know that a lot of you will be working from home and it's difficult to find the time sometimes to attend these sorts of things, so thanks very much. I'm going to start with conclusions because sometimes people's attention can waver during these sorts of webinar sessions, and so I thought I might get the most important parts of my presentation over early. So transport is the fastest growing source of emissions, as we've heard in Australia. And one of the key themes that certainly factors as the unifying theme throughout all of the work that we do is trying to do more with less. So whenever you're developing a transport policy or strategy, working out how you can do that, how you can move people to where they need to go and also goods in a way that uses less energy and also less space. So working on both those principles together. And we need aggressive and sustained action. So aggressive and sustained action is required. And that's just not something that I'm saying, that's something that the IPCC has said in their special report on how to bring down transport emissions. And this, they mentioned this quite a few years ago, is that aggressive and sustained action is required. And the other concluding point is that there's never really been a better opportunity to reduce transport emissions because we've got so much new technology that is enabling people to be able to do more with less. So every year we take a group of transport planners over to the Netherlands and we get a window into the future of what that looks like, what transport could look like in 20 or 30 years' time from now in Australia. By going to the Netherlands. And one of the things that you see there is lots of e-bikes, lots of e-cargo bikes, which is a really big thing. And I know that somebody mentioned that on the chat just before. E-cargo bikes are a real phenomenon because they enable you to do more with less. They cost a fraction of a motor vehicle's cost, and they cost about 20 cents to charge a battery that will take you about 80 kilometres. And you can take 2 kids on the back and you can take a week's worth of groceries. So it's those sorts of examples that I think really offer opportunity to be able to do more with less and move people around with less emissions and less congestion. And one of the really big things that I think is often really difficult for people to tackle and to think about because they are difficult decisions, and that's about road allocation. So at the moment, so much of our transport network at the surface is dedicated to motor vehicles, with only pedestrian and cycling infrastructure operating in the margins of that. And what we've seen from successful countries and successful cities that have been able to bring down their transport emissions is that they've been able to successfully have difficult discussions about how to allocate road space, recognising that our roads have been laid out in many cases 50, 60 or 70 years ago when our challenges as a society were much different to what they are today, and our roads and our space allocation needs to reflect the changes that we've seen both in terms of things like climate change and congestion and healthy communities and livable, vibrant urban places. So our cities have evolved and our streets need to evolve with that. I won't dwell on this too much. This is just simply the billion passenger kilometres in Melbourne. So apologies for those that live in other cities, although the general trend and proportions won't be all that different for any city in Australia or New Zealand. And you can see there that passenger vehicles occupy the bulk of that graph there. In terms of emissions, and Petra mentioned that our transport emissions haven't been tracking in the way that we want them to, and that is true. The National Greenhouse Gas Inventory has identified that our emissions have been tracking upwards. So even though some parts of the economy have been being able to do a better job at bringing down emissions, in transport that's not true. So transport emissions are stubbornly high. They're really hard to bring down because part of the reason is the fact that we buy our cars and we keep them for about 15 years, And that means that any changes that happen today can take a long time to show up in emissions changes. And I'll just show you an interesting graph that shows the litres per 100 kilometres travelled for the Australian motor vehicle fleet between 1975 and 2016. And what it shows is there really hasn't been very much of a change at all. So even though there are some models of cars that are much more efficient, there are also lots of cars that we've been buying over recent years that aren't much more efficient. They have much bigger engines, they're carrying a lot more, they're heavier vehicles, and it's meant that our national fleet hasn't really improved all that much at all. This one is more on congestion than emissions, but it just shows the number of people that you can move in a 3.5 metre wide travel lane over the course of 1 hour, depending upon what mode of transport they're using. So on the far left-hand side, you can see cars, which in highway conditions can move about 2,000 vehicles with the average occupancy rate of 1.1 people per vehicle. You can move about 2,000 people per hour. And as you move towards the right of this graph, you get more space-efficient modes of transport that can carry more people. So in a situation where we're growing as a country and our cities are growing and you want to be able to use space more effectively, moving towards the more space-efficient modes of transport is imperative, whether it be public transport, walking or cycling is something that's going to be really important in the future. And this one here does a slightly different thing. This is some work we did for the City of Melbourne a couple of years ago to help them with their climate change targets in relation to transport. The black balloons represent the grams of CO2 per person kilometre travelled for all these different modes of transport that you can see up the top there. So the bigger the balloon, the more pollution. And then down the bottom, we've got the footprint, and it's not the environmental footprint, it's the physical space footprint in meters squared per occupant that those modes of transport require. So when you're looking at creating a transport system that is both more energy efficient and more space efficient, this graph helps you understand what those modes look like. So public transport, walking, and cycling. For electric vehicles, it's a little bit of a vexed issue, because if you have an electric vehicle and you plug it in to the Victorian grid, which is very much reliant on brown coal, then your emissions aren't particularly good at all. There isn't much of an improvement. You really, if you are going to get an electric vehicle, or a council is going to get a fleet of electric vehicles, they really need to be powered by renewable energy in order to make the sort of difference that a lot of people hope that they'll make. If you're in Tasmania, it's a different story, of course, because the Tasmanian grid is far more energy efficient than ours, although they are going to be now bringing in power from the national grid, which is dirtier than theirs. So there's still a question about that. The other thing we did just quickly for the City of Melbourne for that project that I mentioned earlier was we looked at, because Melbourne's a growing city, or at least it was before COVID-19, we looked at it from a per person emissions perspective. So what does a 50% reduction in emissions by 2030 look like? And if you apply population growth, then you really need to do a lot more in order to bring down the total number of emissions. The per person emissions need to reduce dramatically. And what we recommended to them and what they accepted was that you need strong reductions. So bringing emissions down from about 220 kilograms of CO2 per year per person down to about 140 kilograms of CO2 per person per year. So there's a big change required there, and this is for the City of Melbourne, but it isn't going to be dramatically different for other council areas and other cities that are interested in bringing down emissions to something that adheres to the Paris Agreement. And just on electric vehicles, because a lot of people talk about electric vehicles and they do offer some major improvements on internal combustion engine vehicles. But if you think of a typical traffic congestion scene like the one that's on this screen right now, and these are all internal combustion engine cars, and you replace them with electric vehicles, it would look like this. So it's basically the same. And I think that's important to keep in mind. It's not to say that we shouldn't move towards electric vehicles. It's to keep, the point is that you need to keep in perspective the sort of change that a shift towards electric vehicles will bring, and that whilst they are effective in bringing down emissions if charged with renewable energy, they don't do anything for congestion, they don't do anything for road safety, and they don't do anything for the urban vibrancy of our cities. So it's important to keep that in mind. In terms of the pathways for lowering emissions, again, this is from work we did with councils. These are basically, there are 4 buckets of ways in which you can lower transport emissions. You can improve the efficiency of the vehicle, which is like going from an internal combustion car to an electric car. You can mode change, so going from a car to a more efficient mode, like an e-bike. You can decrease the VKT, so that's the vehicle kilometres travelled. So that's people making shorter trips, so choosing more local destinations, for instance. And you can also avoid trips, which is what we're seeing a lot at the moment with COVID-19, where a lot of people are starting to work from home. And I think everyone, especially senior managers, have been very surprised at the level of productivity that they've got from their workforce, even though they're working from home 100% of the time. I think in the future, what we'll probably see is a hybrid model where they'll balance that out and maybe go into the office 2 or 3 days a week and then work at home the rest. And that can have a powerful impact on reducing emissions as well. Even if you just avoid going into work 1 day a week, that can reduce emissions by 20%. So you can get some pretty big reductions fairly quickly from a fairly modest change in how you work as well. And also, I know that a couple of people on the comments have mentioned e-bikes. E-bikes are a really important way of reducing emissions. So a lot of people don't think about it like this, but of all the electric vehicles in the world, about 96% of them have 2 wheels only. So almost all of them are in China. China's the biggest market for electric vehicles and for electric 2-wheelers as well. But this is a really big change in the way that people are beginning to move around. And a lot of people that haven't ridden a bike for a long time are now starting to find that e-bikes is something that helps them get to where they need to go with less effort and also less sweat, which means getting to work isn't as much of a problem, and negotiating hills isn't the challenge that it used to be. So, and the fact that it uses so much less energy than an electric car, it just means that it's so less demanding on the grid, and it's much cheaper for the user as well. Interestingly, and I just want to share this one thing about electric bikes, is that the average trip on an electric bike is much longer than for a conventional bike. So people are using electric bikes in a different way to how they use regular bikes. They travel further on average, and they also make about 50% more trips on average than people that have just conventional bikes. So, I mean, I've noticed that myself. I own a couple of e-bikes with my family here in Melbourne, and we do trips that we just would not have made on a regular bike, and that happens all the time. So it is much more of a viable option as a replacement to a motor vehicle for a lot of people. And of course, electric vehicles, it's impossible to ignore, especially given the dirtiness, I guess, of the Australian motor vehicle fleet. This is a taxi that I took when I was in Utrecht in the north of the Netherlands about a year ago. It picked me up. We had a conversation with the driver. He does about 400 kilometres a day, and he charges up at a fast charger for free at the end of the day, and then he's got enough charge to do a full day's worth of driving. And this is really where electric vehicles have a great place in our transport system, because the investment that you make in an electric vehicle, the benefits of that are so much dependent upon how much that vehicle is used. And with a taxi that usually does around 300 to 500 kilometres a day, you get a lot more benefit than a private motor vehicle that might only do 20 or 30 kilometres a day. So it really makes a lot of sense for governments to begin investing in electric vehicles for taxis in particular, because they do about 10 times as much driving than a private motor vehicle. So compared to a few years ago, just finishing up now, the evolution of electric vehicles has been really impressive. From, when I started my career in transport, they were, you got 40 kilometres on a charge. They cost a lot. They were really ugly. They weren't very reliable. Now they're much cheaper than they were before. They have much longer battery life, so you can get 400 or 500 kilometres on a charge for some of the premium models. And there's also a wide variety of models, and that's increasingly changing. And we're able to see in the next few years, we're going to get pickup trucks, utes that are fully battery electric vehicles as well, which of course will please the federal government that were very concerned about that at the last federal election. And also increasing charging opportunities. So that's both more charges, but also the charges that are being put out there on the streets are faster charges than what they used to be. So we're getting up to 350 kilowatt charges that can charge some vehicles in under 10 minutes. It's dependent on the vehicle as well. Not all vehicles can accept that sort of charge, but we're starting to see more of that happening. And more government agencies have strong targets for zero emission fleets. So a lot of councils that we work with at least have said that by 2025 or 2028, they want to have all their council fleet over to electric vehicles. So the ingredients for success with electric vehicles are the awareness and social norms, so that people are aware of it, they understand it. It's not just some sort of thing that they've never heard about. They know, if they know a friend or a family member that's had an electric vehicle, they're more likely to take one up. Range is really important, especially in Australia, where we're often concerned about the big road trip and how would that be made on an electric vehicle. And just addressing that is charging infrastructure, and we're seeing large investments in charging infrastructure at the moment. It could still be a lot better, but we've gone a long way in a short amount of time. Also the variety of vehicles, because there are specialist vehicles and vehicles that people are buying to do special jobs, and if they're not made electric, then electric vehicles aren't an option for them. And also cost comparability, and that's really important. Cost is one of the big factors for why people choose the vehicle they've chosen. Some people are willing to make that price premium decision of going with an electric vehicle, even if it's $10,000 or $15,000 more than what the equivalent vehicle is in internal combustion engine. But increasingly, we're seeing that cost come down so that more people see that as an option. Just very quickly in terms of charging. So with the councils that we've worked with, there's often some confusion about, well, what sort of charging? Do you want slow charging or fast charging? And one of the things that we found interesting was that about 96% of all charging happens at home. So most people charge at home most of the time, but there will be occasions where people will need a charge outside of their home environment. And there's this balance between cost and time. So if it's a really fast charger, it costs more to put in and you can charge more for it. And so people like taxi drivers and commercial vehicles will be willing to pay the higher cost in order to get a faster charge time, because time's a premium for them. And then as you go down, visitors, council fleet, they're willing to say, well, you know, we'll pay a little bit more because we're out and about and we want to get enough charge to get us to where we need to go. But they're not making big trips, they're not getting paid to drive, so that they're not really as time pressured as the taxis and commercial vehicles. And then local residents. And local residents aren't going to want to pay a lot. So if you're a local resident in a inner city suburb where you don't have off-street car parking, you might want to seek the services of your council to put in some on-the-street, publicly accessible charging infrastructure. And that will almost certainly be slow charging, where you plug it in overnight, it takes 9 or 10 hours to charge, and then you've got a full battery in the morning. I think this is the last slide now. Last mile freight is a huge thing, especially as we've seen with COVID and so many people ordering online. And so much of our small parcel freight, especially in the inner city, is taken up with trucks that might only be 10 or 15% full, and it's not very efficient for the driver. What we've found in places like the Netherlands is using vehicles like the one on the screen, you can do about twice as many drop-offs per hour as you can in a standard white van. So these are much more time efficient and also, of course, space and environmentally efficient as well. And then this is just some of the bread and butter stuff that I don't think you can really avoid when talking about transport and emissions, and that's bicycle-friendly design. So separated bicycle infrastructure. This sort of infrastructure, about 85% of people that don't currently cycle say they would be willing to cycle if this sort of infrastructure was provided. And then just my final slide here is a street in the Netherlands that I visited when I lived there, and this was a beautiful street, and I took a picture of it because I really liked it. And then I came across, about a year later, I came across this picture. It actually happens to be the same street. So this picture was 1968, and then in 2014, this is what it looks like. So it's exactly the same street. The buildings are exactly the same. They're in exactly the same position. The width of the street is identical. It's simply the space between the buildings that has changed. And so the final point I want to make is that the pain is always in the change. It's talking about it. So imagine what the discussions would have been with the trading associations and the residents about talking to them about this street as it looked like in 1968. And there would have been a lot of fight back. It would have been a very difficult discussion and lots of arguments. And now they've got a street like this. And I don't think anybody is saying, let's return it back to what it looked like in 1968. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Elliot. Last, we have Alice Woodruff. So as mentioned earlier, Alice is the Managing Director of Active City, and her practice designs and delivers travel demand management strategies and interventions that encourage new travel choices to specific destinations, precincts, or at a city scale. Her practice supports communities to choose travel options that help manage city growth, increase physical activity and well-being, and reduce our carbon footprint. So today, Alice will be discussing transport and climate change from a travel behavioural perspective, how we can set a goal of a zero carbon transport system, and how we may be able to move towards this through changing our travel behaviours. I'll now pass it on to Alice.
Thanks very much, Cassie. And also to Petra and Elliot for your presentations, because they very much set the scene for what I'll be focusing on this evening. And just a moment, I'll get my presentation up. So as Cassie mentioned, the focus today for me is really taking a behaviour change approach and looking at how we do transition towards a zero emissions transport system. Three areas of my presentation today. First is, where do we need to get to? And that's where we've really covered that territory through Petra and Elliot's presentation about the big picture changes. What I'll then focus on is a guide or a behavioural model that I apply that will help consider how we can influence our travel choices at a community level. So we're looking at change not just for individuals or particular precincts, we're looking at change across all of our cities, towns, nationally and globally. And the third element is focusing in on 4 building blocks that I argue is what really enables us to, whoops, sorry, I clicked back. Sorry, the 4 building blocks are areas that I'll focus on, which I see are the focus for this work. So where do we need to get to? Well, as Petra and Elliot have already described, we really need to get to a point where we're using the most efficient travel options for how we move around our city centres, suburbs and our towns. And I would reiterate Elliot's point that efficiency needs to be considered both from an energy resource efficiency perspective as well as from a space perspective, given that we have significant growth across all of our cities and also our towns. And I'd argue that the most efficient options for us are walking and cycling, cycling in all its forms. Sorry, I've got a very twitchy mouse, it seems. I'm over eager, so I'll just focus on that second box still. The walking and cycling really is the focus that we need to have, making it the first choice for our local transport trips. And to pick up people's points in the chat that cycling needs to be in all its forms, e-bikes are a critical addition to how we move around locally. It definitely extends our travel options for distance, as Elliot's already outlined, and also consider the other micro-mobilities that are emerging and available to us. Now, change here is highly complex. And
And I'm simplifying down a very complex consideration of how we bring and integrate those elements together to encourage change at a large scale. So what I'm interested in, what are the conditions do we need to have in place for large scale changes in our travel behaviour? And I am focusing today mostly on local travel options. I present this really as what I describe as the ultimate travel demand management strategy. It's not climate change, we are in a climate crisis. We have significant growth in our projections, emissions projections for transport. And so we need to make significant change in our travel behaviour, which is significant mode shift away from private car use. We know in Melbourne, that's my hometown, so I draw on that for a lot of my examples. We still have a third of trips under 1 kilometre being car trips. Under 2 kilometres, that goes up to 2/3. So even at a very local level, we need a significant shift in our travel behaviour to enable us to bring down to zero the transport emissions. So how do we go about this extensive change in travel behaviour at a community scale? Well, in my work, I utilise a behavioural model which helps to guide how I consider how we might change our travel choices. It's abbreviated to COMB. It's Susan Michi's work from the University College of London. There's a multitude of behavioural models. I find this is a pretty good way of bringing together consideration, particularly for transport options. My background isn't behavioural psychology, and being a specialist within the transport sector, this is just an easy way to consider what our options might be. So COMB stands for capability, opportunity, and motivation. So we need to consider each of these components that either in isolation or, but more often in various combinations, influence our behaviours. And what we need to consider is how we shift behaviours from short car trips to short active travel trips. So looking at first at capability, that's about enhancing our psychological or physical ability to enact a behaviour. So am I physically able to walk? That is a fundamental, but also am I able, do I know how to ride a bicycle, or am I confident and do I feel safe walking or cycling? So there are a couple of examples of the considerations around capability, and that is often where we focus on education and capacity building to improve people's individual capability. Opportunity, certainly for us planners and engineers, is more familiar territory. This is where we're looking at providing a physical or social environment, looking at the particular context or setting to enable the behaviour. So that is the physical environment of our cities and towns. Are they walkable or cyclable? Are they dense and have mixed uses so that it's easy to access things by walking or cycling? Is the infrastructure and services available? Are there good connections between walking trips and connecting to efficient, reliable public transport services for longer trips? So all of the detail and the engineering side is definitely under opportunity, but we can't work solely on that, because we also need to consider influences to our motivation, and that's looking at what are the various approaches that we can apply that might change or activate our automatic, so that's our subconscious things that we do without even thinking, our habits and behaviours, and also our reflective mechanisms that might support or inhibit a behaviour. So that might be my personal motivations and preferences. I walk more to keep me physically healthy, but it's also the external influences that can change our motivation. So our regulations, pricing mechanisms, for example, sit here and influence our behaviour. So that's the model that I work with, and I think that's relevant to consider how we transition to a zero emissions transport system. And I'll now take you through what I consider to be 4 of the key building blocks to make that transition happen. So I feel we don't talk enough about this in Melbourne, and that is car parking. We have to reduce and manage the car parking to shift our travel behaviours, particularly for short trips. So this needs to start, within the planning framework, but it also needs to run through to how we manage and allocate on-street parking. There's more than enough evidence to show that that has a big influence on our travel behaviours and the benefits of removing car parking and encouraging walking and cycling, particularly for local economic development around neighbourhood centres and the like. From the behavioural model of COM-B, that's certainly pushing the opportunity and the motivation to consider walking. Looking at the link with public transport for longer trips, here's an example which is work by Joe Eadie and Dwayne Burt at Victoria Walks. They have mapped the relationship between the proportion of people walking to train stations and the number of car parks available. So as we can see here, fewer car parks results in more people walking to stations. The urban form is obviously also influencing the proportion of walking trips. So the different dots, the blue dots show stations that are less than 10 kilometres from the centre of Melbourne, grey dots 10 to 20 kilometres, and green dots more than 20 kilometres. So while there is a bit of noise there, there's a definite correlation between the number of car spaces and the proportion of walking trips. And it's also important to recognise that there are a lot of walking trips already occurring in outer suburban train stations. So the belief that we have to build large swathes of car parks around new stations in growth areas is really a misnomer. If we continue to provide an improved choice of other travel options to those stations, then we can increase the rate of walking and cycling to connect to public transport. The second building block I'll focus on is reducing traffic speeds. This is really fundamental. It taps into capability, people feeling confident and safe to walk, as well as the opportunity and motivation for walking. And we're looking at really reducing traffic speeds right down to 30 kilometres per hour in all of our neighbourhood centres. We have found there are examples already, a multitude of examples in specific local areas, but again, we need to scale this up to support the changes that we need in broader travel behaviour. A couple of recent examples, Auckland has now new speed limits in its city centre area, reduced down to 30 kilometres per hour. And also Wales is proposing a default 20 miles per hour speed limit, not yet passed, but recommended as the national default speed limit. Moving on to the third area is around road space reallocation. As Elliot focused, this is really fundamental. We can't increase walking and cycling rates without giving space to that and recognising, as Elliot described, an evolving city which needs to respond to the change in our travel options. Opportunity and motivation is enabled if we provide more space for both people walking and cycling. A recent survey by CrowdSpot, the Bike Spot survey, identified the safe spots. This is people who regularly ride, identifying areas where they consider cycling to be safe or unsafe. The spots where they identified as safe spots are cycling away from motor vehicle traffic. And importantly, it's swings the other way, that the unsafe spots relate to unsafe cycling infrastructure. And importantly, that's also a call out for people who are driving. So they don't feel comfortable sharing road space. So drivers want a separation of space too. As the other presenters have already covered, we have seen a huge shift and a lot of temporary pop-up road space reallocation through COVID. We need to turn temporary into permanent. We've got a few examples, fantastic examples in Melbourne and Sydney, but they are focused on the central city. We need to shift it to extend these reallocation of road space right out into our neighbourhoods to enable walking and cycling, not just in the city centre. So my fourth building block, not surprisingly, is behavioural interventions. These really trigger capability, opportunity and motivation, because even though we might have the design and the infrastructure, there's a range of other behavioural biases and influences that might inhibit us considering walking and cycling as our travel options. So I'll just pick out a very few behavioural insights from the vast literature, behavioural economics and behavioural science literature. And these points, that are particularly relevant to travel choices and why we do need to have programs and interventions that support and nudge people towards these new travel behaviours. We're not rational creatures is pretty fundamental. We might identify or install a new bike lane. The travel time to a destination might be faster by bicycle than by car if you factor in getting into the car and finding a car park and walking to the destination. But a pamphlet alone will not encourage a change in someone's travel behaviour because we're not rational creatures. And importantly, it's one of the factors is that our preferences and choices are really very relative. They change based on context and they are malleable. So we need to consider what we deliver and implement in one location or one community, considering socio-cultural factors or different physical contexts are really important. So they can work for or against us in encouraging changes in travel behaviour. Importantly too, we're relying heavily on past experiences. So travel behaviour is highly habitual. So once we've got into a pattern, we usually stick with it. And that's where we having programs and initiatives, for example, the City of Sydney's fantastic bike education courses that they run, cycling into the city, is a really good way of breaking habits, but also providing the actual experience to try and build confidence of a new travel behaviour. And importantly, we're social creatures and we compare what others do. So the broader social norms that we have, Australia, social norm, car driving is a very strong cultural social norm. But we can break that down, and it's important to recognise that social norms are at a community level, but they're also more specifically can be at local either social level between friends and groups or within a workplace. And we need to tap into those and utilise them to encourage new travel behaviours. So there's a lot of programs that I could describe. There's already plenty of examples across WA's Your Move program, Transport for New South Wales. Travel Choices program is a really good example, but I thought I'd just come towards the end of my presentation with one of my projects, which is school-related travel. And I really do consider travel to school to be quite a litmus test for how we're tracking around the sustainability of our transport system. If we can't get children to use walking, scooting and cycling to school within local catchments of usually less than 1.5 kilometres, then we're not doing we're not doing our job to transition to a zero carbon, zero emissions transport system. So this project is one of a variety, and we worked with a couple of schools. At that school, we had 83% of students who wanted to walk, scoot or cycle to school, but 69% were still coming by car. So huge motivation from the students, but clearly other barriers that were limiting their travel behaviour. So the approach that we took was designing an intervention that tapped into and responded to a number of travel behaviours or biases. For example, we focused on building social norms around walking and cycling so that they became visible and dominant as travel options to school. Certainty bias is a big factor, so around concerns around reducing risk, and we did that through identification of priority walking routes, mapping those routes and working with the parents and students to encourage walking to school in groups. We also focused on simplifying actions, so rather than the enormity of how I might shift from driving my child 5 days a week, we focused on let's focus on one more day than usual. And we also utilised gamification to really encourage and motivate, to build that peer-to-peer pressure to encourage students to walk more. So the results from that project, a 34% increase in children regularly walking, scooting and riding to school, and 45% of children usually driven to school are walking more. Now, I'm the first person to say, but that's a short-term intervention. What happens, in 6 months? What's the change then? Well, we do know that interventions like this, you get a real ramp up in change, and then you usually get some drop off. So these interventions, they don't, it's not a one-off. Our communities change, schools turn over their student population year to year. But the critical value of these projects is that they help to build new habits. They reduce barriers that both at student, school and parent level. They also build the relationships between, for example, schools and the local council to address the other issues, the other building blocks that I've already talked about. So just to wrap up, just to reiterate, I really do see that people walking and cycling and other micromobilities really do have to become the first choice for our local trips, for most of our local trips. I'd argue that there's many factors that need to influence that shift in travel behaviour, but there are four chunky elements I think we really need to focus on around minimising and managing parking, lowering speeds, reallocating road space to prioritise walking and cycling, and also behavioural interventions to support that change in travel behaviour. And as the other presenters have outlined, we need to scale up rapidly. The crisis is now. Climate change is occurring. It's being measured, and we need to respond. The lag time for policy planning and then delivery is sufficient that we need to act now. And as practitioners, we need to just remember that each of us contributes to achieving our carbon zero TDM strategy. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Alice, for that presentation. And just a quick thank you to all the presenters. Your slides and your presentations and the strategies you've been talking about have been really informative on this topic of addressing transport and climate change. So now I'm going to head to the questions. I'll start off with a question to the three of you. A lot of these questions, we've sort of mentioned them in bits and pieces, but it would be nice to have a discussion. So firstly, What part will future land use planning play in reducing emissions?
I'm happy to contribute first. Pretty fundamental. We do need to contain the growth of our cities, manage growth through improving density to minimise the addition of the increase in emissions. So that is fundamental. I think, again, my hometown of Melbourne, we have Plan Melbourne and the 20-minute neighbourhood approach, which as a policy is strong. It needs to be implemented to have real effect, but you need to have that underlying planning framework and the diversity of jobs and activities within local areas to enable people to reduce their travel and choose efficient travel options.
Yeah, and
Yeah, I might just.
Well, go for it, Elliot.
Sorry, no, please.
I think one of the interesting things that I've learned in talking to groups like there's a authority that deals with planning for new suburbs, and in talking to them they were saying they know Victoria, for example, has a net zero emissions target for 2050, but until that is translated into the relevant rules and planning, the planning system, into the Planning and Environment Act in Victoria, that they can't really sort of make their decisions consistent with that overall target. And that might seem crazy, but so what needs to happen to let those authorities do their work and to make sure decisions are made that are consistent with the state's target is that it's actually translated into all kind of key decisions that will lead to the outcome. And definitely making sure that decisions under the Planning and Environment Act, for example, in Victoria, but equivalent legislation in other states and in New Zealand too. I know we've got someone from New Zealand. We need to make sure every decision is consistent. Otherwise, you can just, sort of end up with a huge new road that just sends things in the complete opposite direction, even when you're doing a bunch of really good things.
Thanks. I don't really have too much else to add. I think that they've been very comprehensive answers. But the one thing that from that question that I was reminded of was probably one of the first graphs that I saw when I was a transport planning student. And it was a graph by Newman and Kenworthy back in 1989. And it was a graph that had one axis that had people per hectare, so density essentially, and the other axis was the kilometres travelled by motor vehicle. And it's a very linear relationship. The lower the density of the city, the higher the level of car use per person, so kilometres per person. And in the areas, in the cities that are denser, they have dramatically lower levels of car use. And you can see this yourself when you go to different cities. I'll draw upon the Netherlands example, where I lived a few years ago, and they have what a lot of people now have started to call gentle density. So it's not Hong Kong style levels of density. It's 3 or 4 story buildings that enable a level of intensity that creates really like a 5 or 10 minute city actually, and it really favors walking and cycling as the preferred modes of transport. So I wouldn't be advocating for the Hong Kong levels of density that you can see in some Asian cities, but rather something closer to a traditional European city where you have 2, 3 and 4 story buildings that can really make it a lot easier for people to get around by walking and cycling, and it also makes public transport more viable.
Great, thank you. So just in terms of this and sort of going on to barriers that potentially government have, do you have anything to say about if there's any barriers for the federal government implementing mandatory vehicle emissions, or is that just political?
Well, look, I might, sorry, go on, Petra, we keep doing that.
There's no barriers whatsoever. In fact, there's huge benefits from introducing it, and it's a very simple policy to introduce. I'm not even completely clear on what the political issues are. I don't know if you've got any further insights, Elliot.
Well, the only thing I would say is that traditionally in Australia, and this is certainly the case currently, is that the National Party get to be the transport minister. So it's always someone from the National Party, if it's a coalition government, as it is at the moment. It's always someone from the National Party that has the transport portfolio. And I think the challenges that a National Party member sees in relation to transport is very different from the sort of issues that we've been talking about, which are urban transport issues. So we've got this disjuncture where we've got around 90% of our population living in cities, but then our transport minister is much more focused on freight and farms and diesel trucks and utes, and it's really hard for them to understand the sort of issues that we've been talking about. So I think that's part of the problem. But in terms of the economic political impacts, it's really hard to understand because, as Petra said, we don't manufacture vehicles. And the other point is that we are a net oil importer. So a lot of the money that we spend on transport fuel, almost all of it is going offshore and not contributing to the Australian economy. So you would think that Australia would want to see, the Australian government would want to see more of our dollars spent locally and less going offshore. But our oil fields have are depleted, and we're now importing more oil than before, and that will continue to be the case. So even from a very basic economic argument, I don't think there's any reason why they shouldn't be adopting higher energy efficiency standards with motor vehicles.
And I think it's important to note too, because something that gets brought up is it doesn't change anyone who's got their car now. It doesn't impact on them. It's about the future cars that come into the market. So we see a transition over time. Often there's a bit of scaremongering about that it will somehow, you know, impact on the cars people already own. It's really about transitioning over time and providing better options to people to purchase in the future.
Great, thank you. So we have talked a little bit about electric vehicles in the presentations. I do want to just go on to now some other modes of transport that we might not see so much in Australia. So I think Elliot mentioned cargo bike use, and there's also another comment about trackless trams in Australia. So what are your thoughts on that?
Look, I don't know a huge amount about trackless trams other than to say that the way it's been explained to me is that they're like laser guided buses, essentially. So I think the most important thing is the segregated rights of way so that they're not trapped in motor vehicle congestion, private vehicles. That's the most important thing. So a trackless tram is, as someone saying, a bus. It's a laser guided bus, but it's essentially a bus. And if you can provide the dedicated rights of way, you'll be able to provide the necessary value proposition for people to get on them. But if it's a laser-guided bus that is stuck in congestion, then it's of no value at all. So I think that the big idea behind it, tracks, no tracks, I don't think that's the big thing. The big thing is giving it its own right of way, which is something that laser-guided buses does. So in that sense, yeah, it's a good thing. But I think the jury still seems to be out. There have been lots of debates between people like Graham Curry and others about whether the things that have been happening in China apparently are really happening and whether they've been as successful as a lot of the companies have said that they've been. But that's really all I can say about that issue.
Great, thanks, Elliot. So I'm just reading the chat box, and it looks like Rayson would like to ask a question.
Yes, thank you. This is Rajan from Bangladesh. I have a question to Elliot regarding last mile delivery. You know that there is a big effect of the cargo freight transport in the urban city, and it is also affect to the passenger transport. So making the hub and spoke system for container shipment to the last mile delivery by local truck and others. So do you feel that is there any big effect to the urban city transport system, especially for working time, that means from morning to afternoon? So what is the measures to avoid such kind of freight transportations in a big urban city? Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
thanks very much for the question. The big innovation that seems to have occurred when you talk to urban freight operators in European cities, the thing that makes or breaks last mile freight by e-cargo bike in particular is having a micro distribution hub. So you've got big warehouses on the outskirts of cities and around ports, and the challenge is to be able to bring the parcels that meet a certain criteria, so a certain size and weight, that are suitable for e-cargo bikes. So typically a smaller parcel under a certain volume. And as long as it's under a certain volume, it goes to a micro distribution hub, which is where trucks will drop off those parcels that meet that criteria, and then it will be transferred onto an electric cargo bike that will take it for that last mile or 2 miles to their final destination. So the critical thing, and this is where government really needs to get involved, because freight operators are concerned about making the first move on this, at least in Australia, because they haven't really seen it operate before, is providing these last mile hubs, which is essentially a small warehouse on the edge of the central city area. So in Melbourne, places like Flemington or West Melbourne or Port Melbourne, to enable that transfer from a big truck onto an electric cargo bike to make that last mile. That seems to be the big thing, and it happens in different parts of the world in different ways. So in the Netherlands, they have a large barge that will move the parcels into the central city area and then have last mile freight vehicles pick it up from there. But that's unique to the Netherlands to some degree because it has a canal network that most cities don't have. But for most cities, it will be using a micro freight terminal. That's the most important thing. Thanks.
There is a supplementary. All of the cities of the world has the priority to give the opportunity to the passenger transportation. During my study in University of Greenwich, London, watched the London city. There is a system of bike. People are using this one from one place to another. But nowadays, it became to the transporting the freight by bike. That is for by courier or commercial companies. So the freight becoming to the micro system and micro amount, and that is becoming the congestions by bikes in the city of London. Is this micromanagement also affecting to the passenger transportations? So what is your experience in Australia about this one? That's cargo is carrying by the bike, like
Sorry,
Patha,
are you asking
Uber, and
about?
other.
Are you asking about
This is
passenger
the
transport by bike?
no, not cargo transferring by bike.
Yeah, well, look,
By
it's
Uber.
happening. It happens every day. Yeah, I mean, anyone that orders an Uber meal tonight, there's probably a 50-50 chance that will be delivered by bike. So we're seeing a lot of deliveries by bike. So yeah, I don't. Yeah, it's already happening. It's happening because of the app-based delivery firms like Uber and others that are using e-bikes mostly to transport various parcels. So that's happening already, and there's huge capacity for it to happen more because you can make more deliveries per hour in inner city areas using that mode of transport. Thank you.
There's a really a great case study in Australia. Actually, the organisation which has the biggest fleet of electric vehicles is Australia Post, and most of those are these sort of slightly bigger bikes that enable the posties to go around delivering letters and smaller parcels, and they're also working on transitioning their vans to electric as well. So obviously they're doing a load of deliveries during the coronavirus, many of them by electric transport.
Great, thank you. So I'm gonna go on to another question, and this is to all three of you. So Eric mentioned that all this information that was presented makes him wonder why more progress hasn't been made. So is it that we as practitioners are not doing enough, or is it because the community isn't ready, or are there other barriers that need to be addressed?
I'm happy to start that one off. I think it's a really interesting question, and it reminds me of a quote. A European Prime Minister once said, "We all know the right thing to do. We just don't know how to get re-elected once we've done it." And I think that is very true for transport. So for a lot of ministers, they feel as though if they look at the census data and they see 90% of people get to work by car, for them, it is a vote loser to start investing heavily in the 10% of trips that, and the 10% of people is how they interpret it, that don't use the car to get to work and other places. So for them, it's a numbers thing. It's about their electability, and it's their perception that if they do things that allocate road space and allocate resources from motor vehicle use to other modes of transport, then they'll have less chance of getting elected when they go to the next election. And so that I think is critical to it, and I think it helps to answer some of the questions about why it is that we know all this stuff about sustainable transport in Australia, but why doesn't it ever get done? I think the other final point I wanted to make on that is that sometimes you can't get 100% community support for something before you do it, and there seems to be this perception that if you, unless you've got everyone saying, yes, we want this street to be converted into a protected bike lane or whatever, then you shouldn't do it. But in actual fact, when you look over the last 40 or 50 years of European cities undergoing their transformation towards sustainable transport, there have been lots of fights, and they still have lots of fights about it. So in places that have excellent bicycle infrastructure, if you go and walk with a historian down some of those beautiful streets now, they can tell you about what that street used to look like in the 60s or 70s, and the sort of fight that they had with traders in order to get the infrastructure that we now see built up. So I think the pain is in the change, and there are going to have to be some choices that are difficult to make, but are necessary in order to shift towards a more sustainable city. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Alice, Petra, do you have anything to add?
Just very briefly to add to that, I wholeheartedly agree with everything Elliot's just talked about. It is often the misperceptions that drive decision making. So we've seen it time and again where traders believe that most of their customers are coming into their store and they've been arriving by car, when in fact it's quite the opposite for our neighbourhood and larger neighbourhood centres. So that's an area that we do need to challenge, and part of that is by experiencing those changes, and that is why there is value in temporary, pop-up, whatever you call it, lighter, quicker, cheaper type approaches where something is installed, car parks are removed, and a new bike lane goes in so that people can actually experience it themselves. And importantly, you then get real data to justify the positive changes that have occurred from that. We do have a highly politicised planning and transport decision-making system. So that is a real challenge that we need to, as practitioners, present and be brave in presenting the alternate views. That's data-driven recommendations to support change.
I'm going to completely agree with Alice and Elliot. I think the first thing that needs to happen is for major transport infrastructure decisions to be made based on transport objectives. I think there's a terrible habit in Australia of political leaders announcing projects that haven't even been thought through, haven't even establish that they have any form of transport benefit, and then once it's announced, there's too much political reputation behind it for people to backtrack or choose something different. So yeah, I mean, I don't see particularly those big billions of dollars projects. So many of them are roads that are announced before they've been properly planned, looked at different options, done proper assessments. So it would be great to have transport decisions made based on transport outcomes and ideally climate outcomes as well. And I see a real risk of that continuing, especially with some of these so-called disruptive technologies. People get carried away with the sort of, they think it's cool. Maybe they announce things before the impacts have been properly thought through. Yeah, so it'd be great if evidence-based decision making was the sort of basis for transport decisions in Australia. I think that's one of the biggest challenges we have, and the result is that like 80% of public funding that goes into transport infrastructure ends up going into roads instead of public transport. So we just continue and continue and continue to feed the bad habits instead of the good.
Great, thanks, Petra. So I'm going to finish off on one more question. I am mindful we're a little bit over time, but this is a question for all three of you, and try to keep it under 30 seconds if you can. So what do you think is the one biggest policy change that can be made at the state or federal level?
All right, well, I might go first. I don't expect all that many people to agree with me on this one. And even within my own organisation, there might not be all that much agreement, but it would be to implement a road user charge. So it would be changing the way that you pay for transport. If you drive more, you pay more, and if you drive less, you pay less. It would do away with registration fees and the fuel excise, and it would be replaced with a per kilometre charge. The more you drive, the more you pay. If you drive at peak hour, you pay more than if you drive at off-peak times. I think that's 30 seconds.
Great, thanks, Elliot. Petra, Alice, do you guys have anything to add?
I guess it's no surprise. Sorry, Alice.
No, you go first, Petra.
I mean, I think that all major transport infrastructure decisions should be consistent with net zero by 2050, which means every decision we make today should be in line with zero emissions.
Great, thanks, Petra.
I have a list, so I'm just going to be a bit cheeky and say that Infrastructure Australia should prioritise and fund footpaths in local communities as much as they fund major road projects and public transport projects in cities. It's at a very micro level that we need to see change and have change supported. So funding does need to come through both federal and state to support local level improvements to encourage our changes in travel behaviour.
Great, thanks, Alice. So I'm just going to wrap this webinar up. So thank you to all our speakers, Petra, Elliot and Alice, for presenting today. We really appreciate your effort and your expertise in the field. And I hope as the audience, you guys found it really insightful as well. I sure did. If you have any questions, we did try to go through the chat and answer most of them, but if you do have some questions that weren't answered, feel free to reach out to any of the presenters or myself. And that concludes our webinar. This was recorded, so if you do want to go back to it, we'll be sending out an email with that link. And keep an eye out for ITE's next webinar, which will be next month as well. And we'll have more information on that shortly. Thank you.
Thanks.